The chill in the air makes you turn to wool, but not when you realize the warmth comes from a sheep's pain and abuse. An eyewitness account, next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, PETA Reveals is a new video series at PETA.org. Don Gaines is one of the storytellers. On this podcast, he talks about being a PETA investigator in the wool industry. For your clothing fabrics, they shear sheep. But don't think for a second it's like getting a haircut.
If a haircut is you and like 300 of your friends all hanging out outside eating stuff that you like to eat and just like walking around and nobody's really messing with you, and then all of a sudden they come and gather you all up and force you to go somewhere and then line you up and send you down a line and make you get a haircut that you don't want and a style that you don't like, and they're just going to do it as fast and as quickly and as hard as they can, and they don't care if they cut your scalp or whatever, then sure, it could be a haircut, but that's not like, yeah.
Gaines was inside the sheds, an eyewitness to the abuse as the sheep came through to be sheared.
And this one sheep came through that he just grew incredibly frustrated with, and he kept twisting her neck and kept twisting it. And I'm like, this guy is going to kill this sheep. Like, I can feel it. Like, if he keeps doing this, he's going to kill her, because he's twisting her neck backwards and like bending down on her, pushing her head onto her back and then bending down with his weight. And I realized when he finished shearing her that she was paralyzed. And I was like, he just killed her. He just killed her right in front of me for no good reason, because he was mad about not being able to shear her quickly.
More on wool, fabric of pain and abuse, next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Share a link with friends. That's important. Pass it around, one set of ears to another. Let all your contacts know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you're new to podcasting, binge away. When you're driving, doing the dishes, before you go to sleep with PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk on episode 1. Or start with this one and go backwards. You don't have to count sheep. See what PETA did for the companion animals adrift during and after Hurricane Florence in episode 36. Find out more about a muscular dystrophy patient from the UK who flew 10 hours from England to Texas A&M to protest that university's useless animal experiments. His interview is in episode 32. Then check out episode 9 to find out more about how Texas A&M tortures dogs. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Don Gaines is a former PETA investigator who saw a lifetime of abuse when he got a job in the wool trade. His story can be seen in a short video on PETA Reveals at PETA.org. But on the podcast, he talks to me about the wool trade and what he saw. It should be enough to make you stop wearing wool forever. Here's my conversation with an eyewitness to the pain and abuse of both the domestic and international wool trade on the PETA Podcast. You worked as an eyewitness investigator, and this is kind of like it sounds like a cool job. What does a job entail? Eyewitness investigator. What did it mean? What did you do?
So what that means is I procure work in whatever particular field it may be. In my case, it was in the wool industry, and I get a job legitimately. I apply. I talk to people. I make phone calls, all of that stuff. And I do work while I'm there. And in addition to doing that work, I'm also equipped with hidden video cameras and hidden audio recording devices. We use those in states and places that they're allowed. And then I capture, eyewitness evidence, footage throughout the day. Mm-hmm. Then I go home at night or wherever I'm sleeping that night, and I review it and make notes. I assemble all of my other notes that I've made throughout the day. It's a lot of documentation on top of working the other job that you have.
So you're kind of like a double agent in a way, huh?
Right, yeah.
So you're working there legitimately, mm-hmm. and you're also working for PETA legitimately. Why is it necessary for people like you to go in legitimately and get a job at these places?
I ultimately believe it's so necessary because based on my experience, I went to places that had 50 sheep. I went to places that had 100,000 sheep. And in every single mm-hmm. place, I witnessed some sort of abuse. And I believe strongly that when we see animals being used as a means to profit, that there's almost always going to be some sort of abuse. And generally, people are afraid to come forward about that. They don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to lose their job. They don't want to perhaps be threatened by someone they work with or something like that. So it's really necessary for someone to sort of be this third party who can go in and record and document this evidence. And if we hadn't found anything, then that would be great, but unequivocally, I guess, we always find something.
Do you end up talking to these people and really getting to know them? And do you feel like they're just kind of stuck and immobile? They can't really come forward because of the things that you said that, they're afraid to lose their job? Or do you think that they care? Do you think they care at all about what they're saying?
It's hard to say. I spent a lot of time in this particular industry with people because you go into these remote locations and you're there for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And in some cases, people did sort of feel empathy and say, I don't know why they have to do this to this sheep or whatever, but they didn't seem to be moved towards any sort of action. They sort of just took it as, well, this is just part of it. And maybe they don't see another way around it.
Could it be that they were just too into their own economic reality of self-preservation that they couldn't be bothered? Or do you think it was something else? Because we know that there are poor people and people in economic circumstances who have tremendous amounts of empathy. You see homeless people on the street doing kind things to animals, sometimes, in urban environments. What do you think is going through the minds of these people? Just their own self-interest or?
Yeah, I suppose it's their own self-interest and it's probably just the way that it is. And in Australia, especially, there may be a little bit of a power dynamic. Shearers, who are largely the ones I observed carrying out the cruelty, they're sort of in power. They're sort of looked at like, if we don't have you guys, then we don't have anything. And so anybody that I heard make remarks was someone doing more of my work, which wasn't regarded as, as important. Particularly in Australia, it's sort of weird because of the way the government takes care of so many people there. That it's hard to make an argument that it was some sort of economic, burden, I guess, that kept people there. I really think it's just sort of ingrained in the culture, and that's just the way it is. And that's the way it's always been.
Well, it sounds like a real cool job. You're in Australia.
No, that was just my assignment.
So you didn't grow up thinking about wool or thinking about sheep as a little kid or anything like that.
No, right. The only time I really heard about sheep was like in church or something, and I didn't have any real idea of what a sheep was or what a lamb was or anything like that.
Right. I guess it must have been a shock when you went into the job and PETA is famous for all its investigations exposing the abuse of animals. And I guess it's kind of cool, too, that you were able to go around the world, find and expose abuse. Tell me, what's it like to do this job? Because I would think it's probably one of the cooler jobs at PETA.
Yes, it is one of the cooler jobs. I got into this because on a staff survey, I said if there was any other job I could have in the organization, it would be as an investigator. I thought it was real punk rock, real DIY, get in there. And a week later, Daphne called me and I'm like, well, I guess they're serious about this. And so it is a cool thing to do. And it's a lot of hard work, but it's very rewarding. And I feel like you can sort of see those results faster than in some other ways. Even though it took years to make some prosecutions, you still get to see those results a little faster. And it's certainly nerve-wracking, but being able to travel and go into all these places is an incredibly unique experience.
I know you're committed to improving the lives and the fate of animals and ending animal abuse, and you saw that things were happening or things were being exposed. That must be kind of gratifying too, huh?
Oh yeah. It's incredible because you don't want all of this hard work and sort of emotional trauma and abuse and all of this. You don't want that to go unwarranted. You want something to happen afterwards. And when the law enforcement officials or government officials see that you're exposing something, you're telling the truth, like here's this hard evidence, and they agree with you, and you start to see this stuff go forward, it's amazing.
There's something really gratifying, it's amazing, and yet it's hard work, and it's not really all that glamorous too, because you're in there doing the dirty work, or at least observing the dirty work. Tell me exactly what the job was like, because you went into the wool sheds around the world. What was it like to be in that job?
So the job that I had would be classified as a wool handler. And so I wasn't doing any shearing, but it put me in a position to see everybody shearing, potentially, from 2 to 12 people on this line shearing. And you go around and pick up the fleeces. And it's mostly in remote locations. A lot of times there's housing on site. So you're partnered with everyone for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, potentially. They have a cook who comes along with them. It is grinding work, and I think it's worse in America, honestly, just because of the way our working standards exist. It's hard work. It's sweaty work. I've lost a bunch of weight. It's physically demanding. Some of the fleeces that you have to pick up and carry can weigh quite a lot, 10, 15 pounds. And you've got to do that 40, 50 times a day or something like that, maybe.
And so you're being paid as a handler. So what your buddies, I mean, were they equally as after an 8-hour the shift was? Or after an 8-hour shift, were they as equally as wrecked as you were?
Yeah, you certainly grow accustomed to it. You get stronger and you get more used to that work. But it's still, at the end of the day, we're all happy to sit down and eat together or drink a beer or whatever it may be. Solely, from a worker perspective of, oh my gosh, I'm glad that's done.
So you went into these wool sheds. Tell us what you saw. You were in perfect position to see what they did. What did you see? How bad was it?
I think it was my second day in a wool shed in Australia. I am standing around helping collect wool, and there's only 2 guys shearing, and some lambs come through. And I didn't really understand the deal with lambs at the time. And I noticed that some of them still had tails. And that's kind of when I put it together that, they're doing something with the tails. I didn't quite know at that point, how they got rid of tails, but only a couple of the lambs had tails. And I saw this guy trying to shear around them. And there's a bunch of feces kind of caked up around the rear end. And instead of doing it, cautiously or anything, he just used his clipper and sawed right through the tail. And he did that twice in a row. And they're like the guy who, quote unquote, owns these sheep and the guy who arranged this shearing contract. Everybody's in the shed with me and nobody says anything. It's just kind of like, whatever. He just throws the tail to the side and the lamb's screaming. It was immediate. I worked at that place only for a couple of days because I got another job. And as soon as that job started, within the first hour, I saw a guy like punching sheep in the face. And it was just sort of constant. As soon as it started, anywhere, as soon as it started.
So a kind of a relentless, vicious abuse is what you're exposed to. And, you talk about the lamb's tails on the PETA Reveals talk. And I guess a lot of people don't usually see a lamb with a tail because they get rid of them pretty early.
Yeah, they take this really tight, basically as a rubber band, but it's just really small and really strong. And there's some little tool they have. They can fit it over the tail and they just shove it as close to the base of the tail as possible. And it cuts off the blood flow. And it could take a couple weeks for the tail to rot off, but the tail just, atrophies and falls off due to lack of blood flow, lack of oxygen, all of that.
And sometimes in most cases, I guess, no anesthetic. And what you saw when the guy actually just lopped it off with some kind of saw, there's no care or no concern at all for the poor lamb.
Right. Yeah. I never saw anybody using any sort of anesthetic or pain relief or, peroxide or any sort of basic thing that you would consider. I never saw that happen. And in that specific instance where the guy cut through the tail, it was just the shearing device, which if you've ever seen a pair of electric clippers that a hairdresser or barber or whoever is used, it's like that, but industrial, and it looks a little scarier. And they just use that to cut through it. So, yeah.
And no one ever said, "Hey, be kinder to the lamb." No one ever stopped the shearer or handler.
No,
because they were all in on this, and this was the way they did it, right?
Yeah, it's get the sheep in, get them out. You got to make your money. You got to get on to the next place and do the same thing all over again. And there's no time to stop and do that because it's all about that wool, like getting the wool off the sheep as fast as possible. And by any means necessary, sort of.
So it's all volume, right?
Yeah. They get paid based on how many sheep they shear in a day, how many fleeces they get. There's a little counter that they keep track.
How many did you see them go through in a day? What was the count? What was the best count?
Someone who is a skilled shearer could do, and depending on the size and the type of sheep, could do 100 or maybe a little more. Smaller sheep, and I heard stories about people in like New Zealand who could do 200 in a day, things like that. And so, yeah, the lesser people would hit 80 or somewhere in there for a day, maybe.
And what was the worst abuse that you saw? I mean, you described the tail, you described the punching, you described just hauling off these carcasses. Actually, they're not carcasses; they're still alive, right?
Oh yeah, after they're shorn, they're still very much alive. Yeah.
And so, what was the worst thing you saw?
So the worst thing was here in America, and I was traveling with a guy, and we were sort of stuck out in the middle of nowhere, and he was working by himself and had about, I think it was 300 or 400 sheep that he was supposed to shear over 3 or 4 days. And I repeatedly saw this guy like twisting sheep's necks and standing on their necks and twisting their legs and just all sorts of, he liked to twist their bodies a lot. And this one sheep came through that he just grew incredibly frustrated with, and he kept twisting her neck and kept twisting it. And I'm like, this guy is going to kill this sheep. Like, I could feel it. Like if he keeps doing this, he's going to kill her because he's twisting her neck backwards and like bending down on her, pushing her head onto her back and then bending down with his weight. And I realized when he finished shearing her that she was paralyzed. And I was like, he just killed her. He just killed her right in front of me for no good reason because he was mad about not being able to shear her quickly. And she didn't get up, and he just sort of pushed her into the exit chute. And right after we had a break right after that, and I kind of ran under there, snuck under there a little bit, and she was still barely breathing, but definitely dying.
Yeah. It's tricky because if you're from a shearer's point of view or the owner's point of view, you don't want to kill these animals because you get another crop.
Yeah.
I don't know how fast they grow it, but they go through a cycle. And how long do you think?
In Australia and America, predominantly they shear them once a year, usually 4 to 6 years is how long they last, somewhere in there. After that, the wool starts to become not as quality. And I heard in New Zealand that they do a twice a year shearing. They'll take off a sort of fine layer and then let the thicker layer grow and do that. So, at max, they're getting 8 to 10, shears, I guess, if you want to say out of one sheep.
I guess they could get to know these animals because a lot of people would say, oh, well, it's just like a haircut, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know. Is it like a haircut?
No, if a haircut is you and it's like 300 of your friends all hanging out outside eating stuff that you like to eat and just like walking around and nobody's really messing with you, and then all of a sudden they come and gather you all up and force you to go somewhere and then line you up and send you down the line and make you get a haircut that you don't want and a style that you don't like, and they're just going to do it as fast and as quickly and as hard as they can, and they don't care if they cut your scalp or whatever, then sure, it could be a haircut, but that's not like, yeah.
Because I don't think people really understand that this is the abuse that occurs. And, they see sheep as quiet and gentle, which makes you wonder, why do they have to be so violent toward the sheep?
It's pure frustration from what I can tell, and probably other things they could work out in their lives other ways as well. Some people want to try to blame it on drugs, but from my experience, I saw one person out of 50 people maybe that I saw shearing on that I thought had a substance abuse problem based on the way he acted. It's just the work itself, I think, creates that kind of environment where you've got these animals who've been deprived of food and water to make them, less strong in the moment, and you're forcing them to do something they don't want to do. And a lot of times they're trying to get away, and that creates this environment where people lose their temper constantly, and they've got, devices at their hand to inflict even more pain than just with their fist.
Yeah. And you caught this all on tape. It's it's on audio and video, and it's part of PETA's investigations. But there must be some of this that still hangs around in your memory, in your mind, and even in your heart. How is seeing and witnessing all this affected you?
Yeah, and there was a place that I was for about 5 weeks total where I couldn't record. It wasn't allowed by the laws of that state, and so I've got 5 weeks worth of material that will never see the light of day by the public. But that's all embedded in my brain, and I can't say that it's crippling my life, but I think about it all the time. It could be the way the weather feels, or the way the air smells, or I was thinking about it the other day. Throwing out a fleece is very much like throwing out a bedspread or a blanket on your bed. And sometimes those things just trigger memories. And it can be difficult to think about a lot. I don't want to go back really and rewatch any of that footage I have, but yeah, it's sort of always lingering there.
Well, you talk about on the PETA Reveals talk, you talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
And is that real, or how have you sought help? Have you come to terms with this, or do you think it's overstated to call it PTSD?
I'm hesitant to call it full on PTSD, but I mean, I've spent some time researching those symptoms. I think there's probably some mild forms of them that I experience. I don't think it's like life crippling, and I don't feel it that strongly, but I can definitely identify with some of those symptoms. And I can only imagine if I had been exposed to, worse trauma that there are people suffering from PTSD have, that just how crippling that would be. These thoughts that I'm constantly having at least once a week, if they were even worse, I can imagine just how bad that would be.
What about the shearers that you worked with? What happened to those folks? And are they still handling sheep?
I don't know the full answer. I know that we were able to get prosecutions in Australia, and I think there were 5 or 6 prosecutions that we got. And those people, I can't remember their full punishments. I know that they got fined, and I'm sure they got suspended from animal agriculture work for a while. In the U.S., unfortunately, we didn't get any prosecutions, even though that's where I saw the most egregious act of violence. So I don't know if any of them are still shearing. I'm sure that some of them are able to get back into it. I would hope that it was sort of eye opening for some of them, and they sought other work.
So you got prosecutions in all these other countries, but not in the U.S. How does that make you feel?
It's super frustrating. I thought we had one of our strongest cases in the U.S., and I think that the law enforcement officials here just had a preconceived idea of PETA, and they just didn't take it as seriously as Australia did. Australia took all of our allegations and evidence very seriously, and they did rigorous interviews and questioning. And I think in general, they're just more serious about that industry because it's so important to them. And here in America, it's not all that important to too many states or farmers. And so maybe if it had been a beef or pork or something like that issue, they may have given it more attention. I don't know. I really struggle with how much they didn't move on anything in the U.S.
But there's no doubt that it should be seen with more seriousness, if not by law enforcement, then certainly by the public. What do you want the public to know from what you've done, from your work? If you could send a message to the public about what you saw being done to the sheep, what would you want to tell them?
I didn't think anything about sheep. I stopped wearing wool, but I didn't think much about them. And once I went through this, I just realized that when we see animals being used to make money for clothing, for food, for whatever it is, for entertainment, there's most likely like 99.9% abuse behind that at some level. And sometimes that abuse is classified as okay by the USDA because they have different standards for farmed animals. But yeah, my single idea or thought is that if we see animals being used to make money, we can almost like 100% guarantee that there's abuse somewhere.
And so what do you tell consumers who want to buy that wool sweater, want to buy a wool suit or wool pants? Should they consider something else? Consider alternatives?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no reason to wear wool anymore. Maybe thousands of years ago when some of us were living in Scandinavia or something, maybe you had an excuse then, but there's no excuse anymore. There's so many environmentally friendly synthetic and natural materials out there that keep you warm and keep you dry. there's no real reason. In Patagonia, even, some of our work has exposed their wool production, but even they are moving towards, less animal products in their clothing line. And we just keep seeing that. You can get a down-free sleeping bag. You can get socks that wick sweat away, and there's no wool in them whatsoever. There's so many alternatives.
Because that's one of the things that I know it's hard for some people to give up, the idea of, the natural fiber of wool, because some of the most expensive suits are wool. But I know there are polyester suits out there. So there are alternatives. So people should definitely when they see a wool item, like a suit or a pair of pants, they should what should they be thinking of?
Think about the sheep that were shorn and abused to create that item. There's no way really to track it quite often. And you can reasonably assume that, or not assume, but you can reasonably judge that any piece of wool, sheep suffered for it. They were cut, they were poked, they were slammed to the floor, they were punched in the face.
So how do you deal with the things that you've witnessed and things that you've experienced?
I try to just keep doing work. My ultimate passion is trying to change the world for animals. And the only way I know how to do that is to just keep doing work. If I can't really stop and dwell on anything for too long, I just have to keep moving, keep doing work, and keep trying to hit those goals, and work as hard as I can to make that happen for animals.
I know a lot of people who see your PETA Reveals talk and who go to PETA.org to see what your work has resulted in will be very grateful for all the efforts that you've done on behalf of PETA and on behalf of the animals. But now you're embarking on something new. You want to open up a restaurant one day. That's your dream?
Yeah.
Total vegan, total no sheep abused, no animals abused.
Yeah. So my city currently, I feel like, is really positioned in a place where we need. We have some vegan restaurants and vegan options, but we really need something that's a little more sort of real food focused. And veganism, in a way, has given me this sort of compass to live my life by, and it's impacted so many things I think about, from human rights to animal rights. And so ultimately, I'd love to have a place that is cooperatively owned, so that people who work there are part owners, and we get to share in the profits, and we get to demand, the wage that we want, and have a sort of real food focused vegan restaurant, and try to put out tasty food that even if you aren't vegan, you can be like, wow, this is really good. Like, I didn't know that carrots could be this good, or whatever it is, and try to reach people with that.
Well, Don, really much success as you work toward your dream, and I hope you achieve it someday. When you open it up, let me know. I'll go up there and toast you, and also not just for the restaurant, but for the work you did on behalf of the sheep when you were working as an investigator for PETA. So, Don Gaines, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Don Gaines, a former PETA investigator, talking about his days as an eyewitness to the abuse that sheep undergo in the wool industry. It's enough to make you think twice before wearing or buying wool anything, especially if you know the pain is built into the fabric. You've listened to Don. Now watch a short video on PETA Reveals, the new web series at PETA.org. And that's our show for today. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com, amok.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. Remember, it helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Emil Guillermo.